Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Classical Academy Podcast, your friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Phillips. You know, folks, we are made in the image of God. We have the ability to look at symbols, and they mean things to us, such as letters. They mean certain sounds to us, at least they should. And it seems like this might be a really good idea in maybe learning how to read. My guest today is Sarah Robertson. She has taught in the grammar school here at Trinity for quite some time. She is now applying her expertise from those 10 years in early childhood education as our grammar school curriculum coordinator, and she's the head of teacher training. Interesting thing about Sarah, she did some Romanian missionary work with orphanages there. She and her husband, after a year, they decided that the Lord was calling them back to the U.S., but those kind of experiences always help to shape you, and I'm sure it has really shaped her heart to love children and to see the need to do what we are talking about today, which is the Logic of English program here at Trinity. Sarah, welcome to the broadcast today.
Well, thank you. It's so good to be here. I'm honored to have been asked.
Well, now, I think people, when they hear Logic of English, they want to know, what is the Logic of English program and why do we use it here at Trinity?
Great question. We use Logic of English here at Trinity because literacy is the foundation of everything else we do. Mm-hmm. If you can consider a house that's been built or is being built, you begin by laying a very, very firm foundation. You lay cement, and it's strong. It's going to hold up and support the rest of that house and all that is going to be built upon it. And so literacy is the beginning of that process. And so if we are not able to lay that strong foundation, all of the other things that come beyond Plato and Boethius and senior thesis, sure, and all of the great things that we build upon it will go nowhere. The sciences, the math that we add to it even are very, very much reliant on literacy. Yes. So the Logic of English specifically, though, refers to an actual curriculum. So Logic of English is the name of a curriculum that we use here at Trinity. It's well named, though, because English typically is not seen as logical. Mm-hmm. And so I can explain that for you if you would like.
Sure. Well, yes, I'm relearning my Spanish with our friend Senor Gutierrez here, mm-hmm. and it is such a more logical language, mm-hmm. to be honest. And so I think it'd be great for people to understand just the basics of the Logic of English. What is it?
Mm-hmm. Well, so the premise of this curriculum is that English can be taught logically. And you often have very literal thinkers, especially we find this in children that struggle to read. They have very literal and logical thinking. And so generally, they need to see things laid out very logically. And in the Logic of English, they like to get away from that premise that English just needs to be memorized. We have spelling that is illogical. It can't be followed. Their whole premise is that you can learn 106 things and spell and read any word.
That's just so fantastic.
So easy, right? Piece of cake.
Man, how about an example? Can you give us an example?
Well, of your 106 things, you have about 75 phonograms. And they're phonograms. The word phonogram means word picture. So
Sure.
This is a letter, including the alphabet letters. There are also phonograms that are multi-letter. So a phonogram like AY, which says the A sound. Mm-hmm. There are 75 of these that exist. Some of them have multiple sounds. So the letter Y, for example, actually has 4 different sounds that it can say. Mm-hmm. The letter U has 4 different vowel sounds that it makes as well. Several of our letters have more than one sound. And we memorize these 75 phonograms. And then we add to that 31 spelling rules. And if you're doing the math right, that should be 106.
Yes.
And those things memorized all together and then used together actually make English very logical and easy to decode, easy to read and spell. And so the beautiful thing about the Logic of English is that when you are learning these tools, and I like to refer to them as tools, we can teach them to a student, and then in a lot of ways, they actually just start to use the tools themselves, and it almost looks like they're teaching themselves to read and to spell, and it's really fun.
That is fantastic. And it does seem to fit this classical idea at the grammar level, where the young minds, young brains, they're like sponges. And so you can present them with these rules. They can learn them very quickly. And then as, of course, they develop into logic and rhetoric, they apply those rules.
Right.
So it fits right into the classical model well.
Absolutely.
I assume it must have, is probably somewhat like the original classical model of teaching how to read.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it is. And memorization has always been a bedrock part of what's happening during the grammar stage of our classical education. And I think that we can build on that. And you'll see in our grammar school classrooms, if you were to peek in, you would see drilling with flashcards, which is a more traditional way of memorizing things like phonograms and their spelling rules. But I also think that our teachers have taken it a step farther, because our curriculum has all kinds of amazing games that help to practice and rehearse and re-practice and re-rehearse all of those same things over and over again in a way that's really fun. So you'll often peek into a grammar school classroom and you might catch them drilling, but you also might catch them just playing a game where now they are practicing all the sounds that every phonogram that they've learned so far can make, and they're doing it in a way where they're being called the rotten egg, and it's silly and it's funny, and they don't want to be the rotten egg, and suddenly they're having so much fun with it, and they don't even realize that what they're doing is they're onomatizing all of these things in the process, and then they'll be able to recall it when they see those same sounds in a word that they're decoding maybe in the next 20 minutes of their lesson. Automatically they're able to use it immediately.
Well, we hear from both alum of Trinity and from universities and colleges where they have gone that the students can read and think very well. And the assumption has always been, that's because their minds are grilled reading this classic literature. Perhaps learning language helps their mind to work logically, and learning Latin helps that happen. But I think in hearing you, it really is going back even further than reading these very challenging classics. It really goes down to being able to read them well. So where does the logic of English come from?
So the logic of English as a curriculum was developed by a woman named Denise Ide. Denise Ide was an educator and worked primarily actually with students with dyslexia, students that were struggling readers. And she realized that there was a type of research that was being used with these students, and it was so effective. They were learning so much more easily. They were overcoming some of their dyslexic patternings and how they were approaching words, and it was giving them great success. And she said, why is this only being used for this population?
Right.
This should be how reading is always taught. Now, I will go back to saying, rewind just a little bit, because it used to be the way reading was always taught. And in the progressive movement in our country in the early 1900s and beyond, the way students were taught to read changed dramatically, and that should maybe be another podcast, because that's a history of what happened in our system that really shifted how we were taught to read as a nation. But this research that Denise Ide uncovered was a better approach, and actually was the original approach, the way reading had been taught really for centuries before the early progressives of the 1900s. And so she uncovered this research, and she developed a curriculum that was accessible to everyone. She realized this should be how we teach students to read, not just those who are struggling, and the logic of English was born from that. But it also began, I will just give credit to Orton and Gillingham, which is a pair of educators and neuroscientists whose research, that dyslexic research, actually came from their work. So Denise Ide was using Orton Gillingham's work, and so if you've ever heard of any Orton Gillingham approach to reading, this is just another one of those, and all of those are great. They all come from the same research and follow the same system and are very similar in technique.
I think people would be interested in going a little bit in more depth about the logic behind this. You mentioned that, and obviously logical things are good things. Perhaps give us a little more detail about that. Maybe give an example and help us really understand how this works.
Absolutely. So at the heart of logic is questioning. And so as teachers, we actually are trying to use questions to help our students to teach themselves in a lot of ways. So a teacher who's analyzing a spelling word with a student might look at a word and then ask certain questions. So for example, it would look like this. If the spelling word was the word bake, B-A-K-E, they would look at that word and the teacher might say, how do we know which k is used as that ending sound in the word bake? And a student has been taught all of the different ways to spell that k sound. There's multiple ways, but they've also been taught some spelling rules that go along with that. So they will know that a C is never going to be used as an ending sound, very rarely as an ending sound in any word. They will have learned that a CK also makes the k sound, but is only used after a single short vowel. So as an added prompt, a teacher might also say, what kind of sound is your vowel making in this word? And obviously in the word bake, it's making its long sound A. So that eliminates that one,
Right.
which leaves them with the choice of a K, which kind of referred to as the tall K, just because it goes all the way to the top line.
Right.
But that is the good choice. That's the one to make in this particular word to make sure that we've spelled it correctly. They also might ask why that A is making its long sound, right? And do you know the answer to that one?
Why?
Dr.
Sure,
Phillips?
that E seems to be helping out.
Good job. That's right. So the students at that point would have already learned the spelling rule that explains when there's a long vowel sound, there's often an E at the end, and the E
Right.
makes the vowel say its long
Sure,
sound.
sure.
So we can take any word like that. And I think it would be an interesting and fun challenge for parents to take a word at home and have their students do a spelling analysis on it.
Fantastic
And that's what we
idea.
call it actually at school. And using the questions and answers, we get them to analyze what's happening in that word so that they're not just memorizing B-A-K-E is always going to spell bake. Because really that memorization is illogical. To memorize how to spell the words of the English language would take you a lifetime. Tens of thousands of words.
Sure.
So we want children to have these tools, we want them to have these basics, and then the ability to apply the spelling rules and the logic needed to decide where we're going to use them and how we're going to use
Right.
them so
Now-
that our spelling is correct.
So does that make strange words like city versus cake versus site or citation, does it make those words fewer, or do they actually
They make
fit
sense.
into these rules as
They
well?
fit into those rules
Whoa,
too.
come
yeah,
on.
There's rules even for that. So because a C has two different sounds, it can say k as a hard sound and
Cake,
as a
yeah.
soft word like in city. And then which of those sounds we are using has to do with the vowels that follow it. So the I next to that city is going to make the C soften to a S sound.
Right.
So again, there's rules for everything. We just have to learn to use them and apply them together, and it makes English logical.
That is fantastic. So now you've got sit from opposite, city, and site, and then you've got cake. Come on, folks.
It's interesting. Well, and I think
Jump
too,
on board.
we add to that. So we take that information and we do a lot of that in the early years. So between TK and second grade, we are drilling and learning all of these phonograms and spelling rules so that they're automatized. We go back to the beginning in third through sixth grade. We start again and we do it again, but we add to it at that point because
Wow,
at that point their
fantastic.
vocabularies have expanded. Their actual reading ability is much more independent at that point. And so we add what's called morphemes to their understanding because English is also a phonemic and morphemic language.
right.
So meaning is embedded in parts of our words. And so they learn a series of morphemes that add extra meaning. So if you think of the words vacation and evacuate, do you hear that there's the same Latin root in
Sure.
both of them?
Yes.
And that Latin root means to go out, right? So when you're vacationing, you're going out, and when you're evacuating, you're going out. That VAC in
Yes.
there helps you know that that's what's happening in that word. And it's spelled the same to hold the meaning in both of those words. But you'll also notice that the sounds change a little bit, right? Vacation and evacuate,
Sure.
the A changes in its sound. And so they learn why that is, what causes that to happen, and how our English words will maintain meaning by keeping that morpheme in place. And it's a little more memorization, but it's adding to their vocabulary
Sure.
at that point and
That's
expanding their
fantastic.
understanding.
Now, along with obviously learning how to spell and read well, and this is kind of an esoteric question, perhaps, but how do you see this particular logic of English beyond just the words, shaping and forming the students?
Well, it's really forcing them to do higher ordered thinking in a way that is exactly the type of thinking we want to encourage here at Trinity.
Yes.
We're trying to form them to be able to teach themselves in a lot of ways, solve their problems on their own. And so it's complicated. It requires a lot of them. It's certainly challenging, and it is a lot of work to learn your basics of it. But then you're able to do quite a lot. And I think you take it from there yourself, and that any hard thing will form you well. And I think we've seen that over and over again. And in a lot of ways, I always have to remind people of this, it's far easier to learn what we're asking them to learn than to just learn to memorize the spelling of hundreds of thousands of words. So.
Of course. Well, and they're flexing muscles that they're going to use second nature in so many other ways, in other subjects, but also in just solving problem solving in life itself. Now, for the parents out there, if I were a parent out there hearing this for the first time, I would certainly be sold. I assume you are out there. But what are some things we can tell the parents or share with the parents that they might be able to do to help their child at home with this beautiful gift that we have, this form of teaching the logic of English?
Well, I would say my number one suggestion is to let their teachers teach them to read. And I say that unless you are very trained in these phonograms and the spelling rules yourself, if you try to teach your child to read at home, you might teach them incorrectly, which causes our teachers to have to unteach and reteach. And a child who has learned to memorize, and that's how they've learned to read, and often that seems to be what happens in many reading programs that are outside of this building, any tutoring programs, any reading that parents tend to do, it tends to be a lot of memorization, and that actually becomes very harmful for a child as they're reading, because it becomes impossible to memorize every word, as we've said.
Of course.
But if you allow your teachers to handle that part, and I free you up from that responsibility, let the teachers handle it, and learn it here at Trinity. On top of that, I think there's some things you can do to support your emerging readers and spellers as they're at home practicing. They need to be exposed to lots and lots and lots and lots of language, and that comes from speaking language, but also reading language. So you should be reading with them and to them. They should be reading on their own. I think that in general, a parent should make every effort to make their home really a place where literacy is the culture of their home.
Yes.
And that would aid us so much here at school. I think that we are fighting all kinds of distractions in the home.
We
and
are.
you could probably think right now and decide what happens primarily in your home. Is it a culture of video games, or a culture of TV, or a culture of everyone on their own individual device? There's lots of cultures that are present in homes right now, but I think if we want to really build strong literate readers, we need to make sure that even outside of this building and the work that's happening here, our homes are also places of literacy. So that happens by modeling reading. You be a reader. Make sure that you're have a book in front of you as often as possible, and it happens by giving your children opportunities to read too, and honestly, read with them. My favorite memories, now that my children are all almost grown, my favorite times looking back were the books that we read together, the series that we read slowly, a little bit at a time, and covered the whole things. Even little things like listening to Audible books in the car. I have so many amazing memories of reading through books that way with my children too. Lots of ways to do it.
Fantastic thing. I mean, I think that's really something for families to think about, to get together and pray about this. And I love the way you put it, create a culture of literacy at home. And boy, you combine that with what's going on here at Trinity, it's going to unlock their imaginations, and they're going to much rather prefer to grab a book and delve into it than to flip on the idiot box or
we
play a
want them
game.
To learn to love story, right?
That's fantastic.
That's the whole point of learning to read in the first place. We learn to love story, and that love of story brings us to the biggest story, the greatest story, God's Word, which is also full of words, and we want them to be pointed towards all of those things, because that's how they become so fully human.
So
much
wonderful,
what we're doing.
So fine. Well, I think this is so inspiring, and it's so encouraging that there are students learning to think this way, learning to approach words, to approach language, to approach literature, to approach literacy this way. And it gives you great hope. And this program has done that for me. So thank you so much for being with us. It's really been a pleasure.
You are very welcome. My
and
pleasure.
Thanks to all of you for joining us on today's Classical Academy podcast, presented by Trinity U, a service of Trinity Classical Academy right here in Santa Clarita, California. Our producer is Shay Ramquist. Stephen Petrie is our audio engineer and provides our original music you're listening to right now. So until next time, pick up a good book, create a culture of literacy, and let's all continue to grow in wisdom, in virtue, and in the love of God. Till next time.